Hello and welcome to the Jewish Heretics podcast. This is the official podcast of the United Jewish People's Order, a progressive Canadian Jewish organization that's been around since the 1920s. My name's David Wall. This, the 18th episode of our podcast, is slightly different from usual. This time we'll be presenting excerpts from a recorded public event. On May 12, 2025, the United Jewish People's Order presented an evening with Peter Beinart at Parkdale Hall in downtown Toronto. The event was an opportunity for representatives from an array of progressive Jewish organizations to ask Mr. Beinart questions related to his latest book, Being Jewish After the Destruction of Gaza, A Reckoning. Peter Beinart is an American columnist, journalist, and political commentator, a former editor of The New Republic. He's also written for Time, The Atlantic, The New York Review of Books, and The New York Times. He's written 4 books himself, including his most recent, Being Jewish After the Destruction of Gaza, A Reckoning. He's a professor of journalism and political science at the City University of New York. He's an editor-at-large at Jewish Currents magazine, a political commentator for MSNBC, and many other things as well. The first questions you'll hear were asked by Cheryl Nessel of Independent Jewish Voices and by Ben Moraine, Executive Director of the New Israel Fund of Canada. And now, without further ado, here are excerpts from an evening with Peter Beinart.
Thank you so much for being here with us. My name is Serena, and I'm the Executive Director of the United Jewish People's Order. Welcome to an evening with Peter Beinart.
I think there's wide agreement that Jews must not be held responsible for Israel's actions. How then do we address the very material ways that Jewish communal institutions provide financial and political support to Israel that contributes to in a very concrete way, to the destruction of the decades-long Palestinian movement for self-determination, including suppression of the Palestinian narrative, stifling of dissent through supporting the IHRA, launching of lawfare suits against universities for supposed anti-Semitism, providing material support for training pro-Israel students to reiterate Hasbara talking points, personal attacks against activists, including Jewish activists, doxing on sites like Canary Mission. Despite the book's title, we seem to be left with not much of an idea of how this reckoning is going to take place. Because I see the reckoning as one that has to be attempted with the Jewish community. And I'm wondering whether, why you stopped short of that possibly, or maybe, you're going to defend that. But also looking at the ways that not only is this damaging the Jewish community internally and morally in every way that you lay out very, very eloquently, but these kinds of actions also support repressive domestic policies, not just in North America, but around the world. So I'll leave it this very long question.
It is really extraordinary to be here, especially in a crowd that I've been told really has people from a pretty wide diversity of different perspectives, which, to be honest, is not something that I get to experience that much, but which I really yearn for. And so I always feel like when I look out at a crowd like this, if you're the person who most strongly disagrees with me from left or right or whatever, you're really the person I'm most grateful is here. I think that in the Jewish community and more broadly, people overwhelmingly tend to go to listen to folks that they already agree with. And I really admire people from whatever political perspective who go out of their way to listen and try to take in different perspectives. One of my favorite lines from Jewish texts is in Pirkei Avot, which says, "Who is wise? The one who learns from all people." So I always feel like the person who's traveled the furthest ideological distance is showing the greatest wisdom. In terms of the reckoning you're talking about, I guess some of what I say may be American-centric, so forgive me. I think there has been a profound dissonance in the United States, and maybe you can tell me to what degree this is and is not true in Canada. Certainly since the 1970s, And this, I think the moral contradiction is now coming to a head. And the contradiction is of a group of people, American Jews, who overwhelmingly and quite passionately believe in the principle in the United States of equality under the law, of states that treat people equally under the law, irrespective of their race, religion, and sex. And that American Jews have done extraordinarily well because America has moved, for all its terrible flaws, in that direction. And yet, at the same time, the Jewish community in the United States has organized itself, particularly since the 1970s, around the unconditional defense of a political system in Israel, which is in many ways the antithesis of the principle of equality under the law. It's a political system. This is a term that upsets some people, but I actually think it's a term that is quite accurate. It's a system of Jewish supremacy. It's a system in which Jews have superior legal rights to Palestinians, most obviously in the West Bank, but not only in the West Bank, even in Israel proper. I've yet to meet a Palestinian citizen of Israel who thinks they are an equal citizen even inside Israel's original borders. And so this effort to hold these things together, I think, is become harder and harder because, on the one hand, there's been a movement among those Americans who are most committed to the principle of human equality. There has been a shift towards a much more critical stance on Israel. And so in order to defend this other commitment, the commitment to maintaining unconditional U.S. support for Israel, American Jewish leadership has more and more come to the realization that its strongest allies are people who oppose equality under the law, not only in Israel and Palestine, but in the United States as well, right? I mean, Donald Trump's Republican Party sees Israel as a model for the United States they want to build. A country with very clear legal hierarchies between people of different racial, ethnic, and religious groups, with an immigration policy that only lets in people of one particular tribe. And so, and the kind of the horror of this, right, is not only what this de facto alliance, most American Jews are voting for the Democratic Party, but many of the most powerful institutions in American Jewish life are essentially de facto in alliance with Donald Trump's Republican Party. And so the result of this is not only that American Jewish political power is deployed to make sure that Israel has a virtually endless supply of weapons as it destroys most of the schools and most of the hospitals and most of the buildings and most of the bakeries and most of the agriculture in Gaza, and leaves Gaza now as the place. And Gaza only has 2 million people, but it now has more child amputees than any other place on earth. So that's one result of this. But the other result of this is to have helped to empower forces that are very seriously threatening the existence of a liberal democracy based on equality in the law, under the law in the United States, right? And Jews are not necessarily the first group of people to suffer as those legal protections, that legal framework of equality fractures and suffers, right? But it will get to Jews, right? Anyone who thinks it's a wise bet to think that Jews will fare well in a white Christian ethno-state, right? Have a very strange reading of Jewish history in my view. And indeed, and this is what I'll stop. One of the remarkable things about this language of an attack, of responding to anti-Semitism, which is the kind of epicenter of this alliance between Trump's Republican Party and the organized American Jewish community, is that if you look at the students who are being expelled and suspended and beaten up by the police in the name of keeping Jewish students safe, a disproportionate number of them are Jews. Right? It's just that they've been read out of the definition of what it means to be a Jew, as the definition has been redefined to mean being pro-Israel, right? So even now, we're seeing Jewish students on campus really suffering in this assault on American liberal democracy. And we see American Jewish organizations, astonishingly, that are complicit in an attack on America's universities, on the independence of America's universities, institutions that I was raised to think that American Jews revered. But this is the moral corruption which begins with the defense of Jewish supremacy in Israel-Palestine and is now leading to being complicit in an assault on the idea of equality under the law in the United States.
I want to make sure we break the kumbaya in the room. If we're going to have a conversation among progressives about could the left be united, I think we've got to talk about what separates us and what divides us. My day job is that I'm the executive director for the New Israel Fund of Canada, which means that we're the preeminent funder of Israel's left, basically. The Israeli human rights organizations, which, for those who don't know, the Israeli human rights organizations that work on Palestinian human rights, and Israeli organizations that are doing Jewish and Arab shared society within Israel, and organizations that are Palestinian-led organizations doing Palestinian citizens-led organizations doing equality within Israel, as well as women's rights and the whole gamut. That puts me in an awkward position sometimes, representing the Israeli left in Canadian left-wing spaces. And, my experience over the past, 2 years, I'm so disappointed with both, like, my community, the Jewish community. I'm so disappointed with the pro-Israel camp. And I'm so disappointed with the pro-Palestinian camp. I see mirror images of rage and prejudice. It's very hard for me to find a progressive space that doesn't dehumanize Israelis or Zionists. It's very hard for me to find a Jewish mainstream space that doesn't dehumanize Palestinians. And focusing on the progressive side of that, I absolutely won't associate. I won't sit on stage with some on the left precisely because I don't see humanist values exhibited out of them in their words or in their work. So at this moment, I don't think there can be a united left. I actually believe that my conversations with Canadian political leaders and broad swaths of the community are more powerful without a divided left, because some parts of the left are so undermined by their bad actors. So first of all, I want to say that that's a real divide in this room. Should there be a united left? Could there be a united left? What do we do about the bad actors on the left to make me extraordinarily uncomfortable and in a matter of principle? That matters to me. So I have an honest question, why bother with a united left? And if so, who's responsible for fixing it? Is it me? Is it Cheryl? Is it you? That's it.
Thank you for that. I guess it depends, I suppose, a little bit on what one means by united, and maybe what one means by left even. I mean, I think when I think of movements that have been able to make great moral change, it seems to me they have generally brought together people who spoke in very different voices, and actually even to some degree had different visions. And some, there were clearly people in movements that I would really admire who were participants in those movements who said things that I would have found at the time really, really unpleasant and even repugnant. I mean, the anti-war movement in my country, the United States, was a great moral movement, right? But it also had people famously who at times were disrespectful to American soldiers, didn't treat American soldiers with the dignity, the human dignity that they deserved, sometimes spoke very flippantly about the North Vietnamese as if they were angels, when it became very, very clear in 1975 that they were not angels at all, right? In fact, that they produced a pretty brutal, repressive government of their own once they took Saigon, right? I remember I remember showing up at college during the anti-apartheid movement, and I thought I really wanted to be part of that. My parents were South African. I felt like I knew the ANC leadership like they were like my baseball cards, you know. And I remember, you know, showing up on campus and a group of students were chanting as part of an anti-apartheid protest, "It's a black thing you wouldn't understand." And I was really upset by that. I was like, don't you know that Joe Slovo, the head of the military wing, you know, is a Jewish guy from Lithuania, you know, and so I sometimes hear things in pro-Palestine solidarity movements, I think, that reflect some of the things that you're suggesting. I remember I was at Columbia University for like 2 straight days, actually over Shavuot, you know, wearing a kippah as I do on Chagim, and encountered many really beautiful experiences, and also heard a bunch of people chanting, "Settlers, settlers go home, Palestine is ours alone." And they weren't referring to settlers just in the West Bank. And some of them, many of them, most of them were not Palestinian. They were just random American people. I felt like, who the fuck are you to tell the Israeli Jews they need to go home? What are you talking about? This is not a moral vision. So I've had those experiences. I think it's important to say that, you know, moments like this, moments of extreme destruction and brutality, don't always bring out the greatest, don't always bring out the most generous side of people. I also think that one needs to, I'm a little careful about the analogy between the kind of pro-Israel and the pro-Palestine forces, not because I think that pro-Palestinian people are having any inherent moral superiority, it's just there's a huge power imbalance, right? So when we think about the harm that's done between someone on a college campus who is saying something that's dehumanizing of Israelis, we also need to remember that that person does not have the power, right, to actually take that dehumanization and get it into weapon and turn it into a weapon that actually blows up someone's home, right? Doesn't mean it's right. I believe that people should still be criticized even if they don't have a lot of power, but I think that power dynamic is important. And I think that it's important to try to lead with whoever one's talking to with empathy and with curiosity for the perspectives that people have. So I believe that one has to, I agree, Ben, that one should work hard to try to maintain the kind of moral hygiene of a movement. But at the same time, I also think that one needs to recognize that big movements that can be big enough to produce huge amounts of change are never going to be entirely able to police themselves in every way, right? And that the fundamental thing to me is, it's less important to me what is one chant or one particular person says or what person says at a chant. The question to me is, what is the core demand, right? What is the core call? And it seems to me, again, in the United States, when I look at this movement, I feel like the core demand is for the United States not to be giving Israel the military and diplomatic impunity that allows it to destroy the people of Gaza and Palestinians more generally. And that seems to me a fundamentally moral demand.
Okay, very long question number 2. So one of the things that you accomplish in the book is a very clear indictment of Israeli apartheid with concrete examples and arguments, and even a cursory glance at legacy Jewish groups' social media and other pro-Israel communiques reflects a Zionist narrative that ignores or rejects the historical record put forward by respected historians, such as Rashid Khalidi, Omer Bartov, Avi Shleim, Enzo Traverso. Once upon a time, Jewish intellectuals actively influenced Jewish life and institutional life. Now the dominant force is an empowered donor class, and many critical Jewish intellectuals face censure and worse. So I'm thinking of the withdrawal of historian Raz Segal's appointment to an academic position at the University of Minnesota last year after publishing his article, A Textbook Case of Genocide in Jewish Currents. Has Jewish communal life sunk into a dangerous anti-intellectualism, and how might we turn this around?
Thank you. I think, I think you've really put, again, I can't speak with authority on Canada, but in the United States, I think you've put your finger on something that's very important. I think it partly has to do with what we have with the United States' just obscene level of income inequality. Because one of the consequences of this income inequality, you see it in the Jewish world, but you see it beyond the Jewish world, is that institutions become more and more dependent on a small number of hyper-wealthy people. And so everybody quivers and quakes in the presence of these billionaires and, or millionaires. I've heard I sometimes hear rabbis say things like, if I critical of Israel, I'm going to lose people in my synagogue. And I sometimes have said, I've had a bunch of, over the years, I've often said, yeah, but don't you think you'll gain some people too? And they're like, yeah, but they're not the same people, and then you see what's really going on here. I was once asked to give a talk I won't mention it, but in a significant major American city. And then I was told that there was an outcry by the Jewish community against me giving a talk at this Jewish community center. And so they had to move the talk somewhere else. So I said to the person, maybe I could meet with some of these people who were so upset, because I have a lot of experience with right-wing Jews, some of my best friends and family members. So I felt like we could have a good conversation. And then they did set up a meeting for me with one person. And this person was the emissary of the person who, as far as I can tell, funds everything Jewish in this city. And that was just a kind of window into this. Yes, so, and you can see this in the shift in pro-Israel politics. What's really interesting is, and you can look at the glass as half full or half empty, right? AIPAC completely changed its funding, it's the way it intervenes in American politics a few years ago, right? So they could raise much, much more money, right? And they've deployed that money in congressional races very, very effectively, right? But the reason they had to do that is because there was an intellectual and cultural shift that is taking place in the United States. You can see it in polling. You can see it in even very corporate mainstream media. You can see it in Hollywood. You can see that the legitimacy of a position that claims to be liberal, but supports Israel unconditionally, intellectually has just completely collapsed in the United States. And so that's good news, right? But actually what AIPAC realized was that you basically could lose the intellectual and cultural debate, and you could basically respond with just massive amounts of finances, and then it really doesn't matter that much, right? That you don't have good arguments and you don't have credible intellectuals making these arguments, right? And so I think this is part of the problem, and it's part of the way in which the problem in the United States with Israel policy is so interwoven with these other things. If I can just say one more thing, just because it's an anecdote I love so much. I also noticed, and this may be a particularly New York thing, that there's a certain group of people who like to say that they are opposed to the left or even opposed to the Democratic Party because the Democratic Party is anti-Israel, right? But I often notice if you get to know the folks, you realize it's not always clear where their views about Israel end and their views about things like tax rates begin, right? That these two things are often very, very merged, right? There was a right-wing Jewish talk show host in the New York area who interviewed Chuck Schumer many years ago. It's one of my favorite moments in American Jewish life. And Schumer has this thing that he says again and again and again and again. So he says, my last name is Schumer. My family, we always saw ourselves as Shomrim, as the guardians of the Jewish people. That's still how I see myself, as a shomer, for the Jewish people. And the guy listens respectfully, and he says, that's great. And he says, do you think you could also be a shomer for not eliminating the carried interest loophole elimination? So it's like it gives you a sense sometimes of what pro-Israel politics in New York are really like.
I'm Cantor Cheryl Wunsch. I'm the spiritual leader of Congregation Shir Libeinu. We are a small, progressive, independent, queer, downtown Jewish synagogue. It's a lot. Who's been working very hard at keeping our doors open and we think a lot about how does a Zionist and a non-Zionist pray next to each other and it be okay. In your book, in your writings, you talk about what you just mentioned, this theology of nationalism, how so many North American Jews have replaced God with Israel or Zionism as their main Jewish focus. And so I really want to think about being Jewish after the destruction of Gaza in a spiritual way. And so much of our text, so much of our liturgy, so much of the things we study has this language of Israel and Zionism. And on an intellectual level, it's pretty easy to say, well, that's aspirational. It's talking about this ideal of Zionism of Israel, or it's talking about Am Yisrael, and it's not about the political nation state. And yet when it comes down to it, when we're sitting in shul or sitting in Torah study, that becomes a real pinch point. There's a cognitive dissonance, there's a moral dissonance. And there's a tension there with the language of our prayers and our text and the way we're feeling. So I know you're not a theologian, but I also know that you are a person with a Jewish spiritual life. So I'm wondering, and if this is too personal, you can say so, but how do you, and maybe how can we, sustain a spiritual connection to our holy texts and our prayers when the language itself evokes this political reality that many of us are actively questioning or grieving?
Thank you for that great question. I mean, just to say one thing which is maybe obvious is that when these texts are talking about Zion, about Israel, these are mostly texts that are written in an environment where there is no Jewish state, right? And not only in which there is no Jewish state, but as you know, in which the kind of normative dominant Jewish theology, framed by, Masechet Ketubot and the three oaths, is basically the idea that Jews actually cannot try to recreate a sovereignty until the Messiah comes, right? Which is the kind of rabbis of the Talmud's response to the trauma of the Bar Kokhba rebellion and the belief that basically that the recreation of Jewish sovereignty will not end well. I mean, and so I guess for me, I think it's important to try to distinguish these different meanings of Israel, right? Israel is the name of a people. Israel is the name of a land. And then much, much more recently, Israel is the name of a state, right? Jonathan Sacks, who's not, was not before he died, not a lefty, made the point, writing about last week's Parsha, about Acher Remot, it makes the point that the Israelites are given, that it's true that the Torah can be reread, certainly from Exodus on, as the story of the movement towards the land. But it's also significant that the law, right, that Matan Torah is given at Sinai before the Israelites enter the land, right? So that in some ways, that if Jews become a people, right, once they with the giving of Torah, that happens in Bamidbar, in the wilderness, in the desert, not in the land, right? And so I think it suggests that the land, that there are certain moral obligations that the Israelites are given, right, that have to inform how they behave once they are on the land, right? And so it seems one way I think about it, again, I'm certainly not a theologian, is that if we believe that there is some holiness to the land, right, and I think that's a reasonable thing to believe, there are certain mitzvot that can only be done in the land. First of all, it's important to remember that the land is not coterminous with the state, right? Some of these mitzvot that can be only done in the land of Israel could be done in what's now southern Lebanon. And that the holiness of the land was equally holy when it was under Ottoman control and under mandatory British control and under Roman control. The holiness of the land is not dependent on who has sovereignty over it, right? And if one takes the idea that holiness should have something to do with the idea of respect for human dignity, because the first people we encounter in Torah are not Jews. They're not proto-Jews. They're not even proto-Jews. They're not Israelites. They're not Hebrews. They're universal human beings, right? No, I don't know any Jewish thinker who claims that Adam and Eve and Cain and Abel and the generation of Noah and the generation of the Tower of Babel are Jews, right? They're universal human beings. And they're the first people we encounter, right? Which is the rabbis say, to show that we are all from one God. So no one can say that my father is greater than yours, that I come from some higher species. So if holiness is connected to the idea of universal human dignity, right? As Abraham Joshua Heschel said, that the only thing created in the image of God is the human being, every human being. If that informs our notion of holiness, then we should think that this holy land, right, it will be even more of an it will be even more objectionable, even more unholy, even more perverse, right, to have a state on this land that denies human dignity, that destroys human dignity, right? The story of Jewish sacred texts is the story of Jews creating kingdoms, and those kingdoms displeasing God for a variety of reasons, but in part because of their barbarism and their brutality and their idolatry, right? And then the Jewish kingdoms come and the Jewish kingdoms go, right? And what remains, I think, is the holiness of the land. As the texts say, that the land will vomit you out, right? To me, this is what Israel is doing in Gaza, what it's doing in Masafer Yatta, what it's doing in East Jerusalem, is a profound, profound defiling of the holiness of this land.
I'd like to welcome Alejandro from Jewish Faculty Network.
Hi, thank you so much. Thank you for inviting me, and thank you all for being here. And I've really enjoyed the discussion. I really enjoyed your book, Peter. And I have a two-part question, which is really just a ruse to say I have two questions. So this is a sophisticated, nuanced, and highly readable book, one which I immediately want to send to close family members, and also to some of my hardcore right-wing Zionist colleagues at the universities, those colleagues who consider that I'm not Jewish because of my political beliefs. I think what I appreciate most about this book, and that came up in some of the questions already, is that it describes a journey, both your journey in some sense, but also a journey that many of us have been on and can identify with very strongly, where we're learning to read ourselves differently and learning to think of the state of Israel differently. And the reason I want to send it to so many people is that it also invites the reader on a journey. And here, maybe I'm reading it a little differently than you, Cheryl. I guess the first part of my question then is how much of that was intentional? The role of author as rabbi, leading your people who have gone seriously astray in so many ways, but in particular, as you note in chapter 5, who participate wholeheartedly in Avodah Zarah, of worshiping the state of Israel and its particular form of Jewish supremacy. So that's the first part. The second part of my question is maybe a little more critical, or has to do with the part of the journey that isn't a focus in your book. And the easiest label for this part of the question is race and empire, which you do touch on here and there, but this theme remains mostly unspoken background. I'm thinking of cultural historians like Amy Kaplan, Keith Feldman, Robin Kelly, among other critics of the US as a leader of post-World War II imperialism. One thing that kept coming up for me as I read your book, how is it that ideas about Israel as Jewish, ideas you diagnose and challenge Jewish supremacy, how is it that those ideas come to make so much sense to so many Jewish people across Europe and North America in particular, especially given our history? There's a lot of reasons for this, but one of them has less to do with the state of Israel per se, even if it is coded as support for the state of Israel. This reason has to do with the ways that the descendants of the 19th century European Jewish communities have become full citizens, and thus in the 20th century, how the Jewish question of Europe has been answered. It's been answered mostly by Jews becoming settlers in European colonies outside of Europe. whether the US, Canada, South Africa, Australia, or Israel. And that is how Jewish populations also became perceived, for the most part, as white. So my question is, how do we challenge this settler whiteness, of which so many Jewish communities have become willing participants, and which contributes so much to our success, our stability, our upward mobility, and so on. And so, in the beginning, you even suggested if we go down the route of this all the way to Christian, nationalist, white, ethno-state, we're in trouble, right? How do we add that part of the challenge to this journey?
Yeah.
Thanks.
Thank you. Wow, that's these are big and difficult questions. I think you're right that one of the thing that I kind of cling to, I guess, is the fact that even though most Jews have become have been attained whiteness and are treated as white, again, most, not all, but most, or most in many circumstances in which they live, and are benefiting from all of that privilege. In the United States, at least, you still see that Jews don't really act politically like most other white people, right? The Jewish organizations, in some ways they do, but Jewish voting behavior is actually quite different, right, than the voting behavior of most white Americans. Most Jews, will vote for the Democratic Party very, very consistently. It's not a left-wing party, but it is the more left of America's two parties. And I do think it is because of some folk story that exists in people's minds that says, when we look at people who are now marginal and discriminated against, we see our own ancestors, and there's something about our sense of safety that should be involved with aligning with them. And I think what you see and I think there's a struggle among Jews about this question, about whether to fully embrace this settler colonial kind of narrative, or whether to resist it. And it's played out in many different places, right? In South Africa, where my parents are from, for instance, in 1964 at the Rivonia trial, when Mandela was prosecuted and then sent to jail for 27 years, all of the white defendants were Jews, because Jews were massively overrepresented among white people in the anti-apartheid movement, as Jews have been overrepresented in movements in the United States. And the prosecutor was Jewish as well. The prosecutor was the president of a large Orthodox synagogue in Johannesburg, Percy Utah, the attorney general of the Transvaal. And so there was a kind of a debate in the Rivonia trial about where Jewish interests lay. And I think we see that today, right? We see it in the debate between those Jewish organizations that are literally giving the Trump administration the names of non-citizen pro-Palestine activists who they want to be basically sent to gulags in Louisiana, and the debate between them and between those Jewish students who I saw a few weeks at Columbia, who after Mahmoud Khalil was grabbed off the street, chained themselves to the gates at Columbia. So there is still this debate. And what I think that what I fear is that if the United States moves in a more and more authoritarian direction, which gives more and more power to those forces in the Jewish world and in the Jewish community and beyond, who are deeply, deeply invested in the kind of the myth of the settler colony, that will help Israel move along that trajectory itself, right? I think that one of the reasons that people on the right in the United States so identify with Israel is because Israel's founding kind of settler colonial myth is so similar to America's. It's kind of like a promised land forged on a hostile frontier, right? And so it's the people who are most resistant to questioning those things in the United States that are most willing to give Israel carte blanche to kind of move along that trajectory, right? I mean, I think the Israeli government has essentially kind of made a decision, right, that its solution to October 7th will be to have as few Palestinians around as possible, right? And that is, in a way, a kind of an American, or maybe I could even say Canadian-style answer, right? Because that was how, the United States in the 19th century had groups that would have struck many white Americans as being a lot like the way Israelis view Hamas, right? I mean, Native Americans have been pushed off their lands into smaller and smaller enclaves, just as people in Gaza, who are mostly the descendants of refugees who were expelled in 1948, are in these enclaves. And when Native Americans in the United States had the chance to break out, they often committed terrible massacres, right? And then the response in American discourse was not to understand that these massacres were a response to legitimate grievances of dispossession but actually to describe them as barbarians and savages, which is the way that they're often described in Israeli and Jewish discourse, which then leads to their even greater dispossession. And so that is, I think, where settler colonialism is taking us. And I hope that there will be enough Jews who who ally with other groups of people who have in their own histories a sense of the brutality of settler colonialism to try to oppose that process in Israel and Palestine, and to try to have some willingness to interrogate these things in the United States. Because the attack on DEI, and I'll stop here, the attack on DEI and on wokeness is really an attack on anybody who actually challenges these founding myths of the United States.
Karen Golden from Standing Together.
Hi, everyone. Thank you. As Ben was saying before, I think that one of the reasons why you're so effective, other than wealth of knowledge and smarts, and that is that your criticism of Israel comes from a place of such enormous caring for the Jewish people and for all people. And your description of the current supremacy of Israeli Jews and the violent subjugation of the Palestinians is really breathtaking, not in a good way. However, I wonder if your insistence on asking the Jews to sort of get over their sense of vulnerability that's informed by their history is posing an obstacle to peace, practically speaking. And self-serving, is it better not to take an approach like Standing Together, where we don't focus as much on the specific solution, but we're building this mass movement committed to these core principles of peace and equality? And related to that, and sort of at the core of, what is practically helpful for our brothers and sisters on the land. I think in your book you seem to indicate a two-state solution is not possible now or in the future. And if that's the case, how and why is a one-state solution possible now or in the future?
Thank you. I guess the way I think about it, it's certainly not that I don't think of myself as asking or wanting Jews to forget the traumas of the Jewish past, or indeed forget the trauma, the horrors of October 7th. I mean, we're very lucky that just today an Israeli-American hostage, Idan Alexander, is being freed, and I would never want people to forget the people who were killed on October 7th and the Israelis who are still in captivity, living in unimaginable fear and pain in Gaza today. But I think that sometimes, the way many Jews narrate the story is to say, because we have this very, very terrible history, that this makes us believe that we have to have a state in which we rule. And that the terrible fear that Jews have of what would happen if Jews didn't rule, if there was equality, which would give Palestinians an equal share and an equal voice in government, that the idea is that Jews are terrified of that because of our traumatic history. But one of the points I wanted to try to make in the book was that if we de-exceptionalize Israel and Palestine a little bit, we actually see that this fear is actually quite common among groups of people who become accustomed to systems of legal supremacy. So Protestants in Northern Ireland didn't have as traumatic a history as Jews did, but they were absolutely terrified of the prospect of Catholic political equality. Ian Paisley, the Protestant leader, said on the eve of the Good Friday Accord, which gave Catholics political equality, he called it a prelude to genocide. White South Africans, were absolutely convinced that a democratic election which brought a black government to power would mean that they would be slaughtered. It was considered as obvious to them as it is to Israeli Jews now. And in the United States, this was the dominant discourse during slavery and segregation, right? That if black people weren't slaves, then white people would be slaves. And so I think that without forgetting our own particular traumas, I think it's worth realizing that this inability to imagine equality as meaning anything other than one's own death and subjugation is a very normal way for people who become accustomed to legal supremacy. And so one of the things I wanted to try to do in the book was try to ask Jews to think about the question of why the Protestants in Northern Ireland and white South Africans and white Southerners in America were wrong. Because the argument that white South Africans made that I heard very frequently had a superficial plausibility, which is not so different, I think, than the argument that you hear from many Jews today, which is to say they could see that there were armed groups trying to kill them, right? I mean, the African National Congress is not a nonviolent organization. It was armed by the Soviet Union. It was considered a terrorist organization by the United States. It was blowing stuff up. The IRA was blowing up buildings in London and doing a lot of really nasty things. And so the idea is, if we don't have a supremacist state, that's our shield, that's our protection. If not for that, then basically we will just be at the mercy of these forces that, by all accounts, are determined to kill us, right? But what I think this logic misses, right, is the interplay between the interplay of violent oppression and violent response, which is to say that the IRA were not such great guys, a lot of them, and even the ANC, which we put on a pedestal, were actually doing some pretty awful things. They were torturing people. They had to admit they were torturing people in their camps. But once Catholics got a genuinely equal voice in government in Northern Ireland, Catholics had a way of getting the government to respond to them, which didn't require them to take up arms. They had the vote, right? And under those circumstances, I think the vast majority of people would much rather try to get their needs met through being able to vote and petition a government than taking up arms is generally a last resort, right? And I think you can even see this inside Israel itself. Why is it that Israeli Jews who are terrified of going to the West Bank, let alone Gaza, go onto the operating table inside Israel under the knives, literally the knives, of Palestinian doctors and nurses, and then they get their drugs from Palestinian pharmacists, because there are a lot of them, right? And because these are Palestinians too, you can call them Arab Israelis all day, but they're Palestinians, right? And I think part of the reason that Israeli Jews don't fear violence from Palestinian citizens is because Palestinian citizens, although they're very severely discriminated against, have some mechanism to relate to the government and get their needs met because they have citizenship and the right to vote. Whereas if you're in Gaza, you have no way of trying to get the Israeli government to act differently towards you, right? What are you going to do? You have no levers. Even when you do the things that we might applaud, like large mostly nonviolent marches, like in 2018 in the Great March of Return, Israel basically put sharpshooters on the fence and just shoots people one after another. After the Great March of Return, they had to create an amputee soccer team in Gaza. So many people had been shot in the knee, right? And so I believe this is at the root of my support for one equal state. I believe that in divided societies, when everyone has a voice in government, everyone is safer, because people are most likely to take up arms when they are locked out of political power and when the gun becomes their only way they can imagine to actually get the state to listen to them. And that's why I believe, although again, obviously I'm considered a lunatic by a lot of people. That's why I genuinely believe that I don't think it's an accident that Israel is actually the most dangerous place for Jews to live in the world of any large-scale Jewish community, right? that Jews are actually generally safer, even as small minorities, in countries that have some aspiration towards equality under the law, because I think equality under the law creates safer societies for everybody.
I'm a member of If Not Now Toronto, the local branch of the movement trying to end Western support for the occupation and apartheid. My question for you is about liberal language. So personally, I find how you speak and how you write very soothing, as you tend to use fairly uncontroversial liberal principles like democratic values and legal equality to argue for solutions that some people see as radical. Can you speak a bit more about this strategy? Why have you made the decision to approach the debate in this way? Maybe it's just who you are, but can you speak a bit about your position in the debate, and speaking with calmness and trying to reassure, and how that contrasts perhaps with some other voices?
Thank you. I mean, the first thing I should say is that regardless of the way I speak, I have a tremendous privilege in this conversation that I often am reminded of, right? I mean, I noticed that, obviously there are a lot of people who don't like me, but there are, people respond, I think, with less hostility to me because, than they would to a Palestinian, who just by virtue of being a Palestinian is much more scary to not just many Jewish audiences, but in the United States to just white audiences in general. And in fact, one of the things that I worry about a lot is the way in which the role of Jews like me, who are Jewish critics of Israel, actually end up crowding out Palestinian voices. Because if you're going to have to put on a critic of Israel, at least put on Beinart, because he's a little bit harder to be called anti-Semitic, right? Rather than have the hassle of putting on a Palestinian, then you're really going to have people angry at you. So that's a real moral dilemma that I think Jews like me really have to wrestle with, and it's part of the reason that on my Substack I spent, so many of the people I interview are Palestinian, because I feel like in some ways it's almost like my obligation is to try to begin to change a conversation, begin to try to platform more people so that it won't always be like this. But I also think being male and middle-aged and kind of bourgeois looking in a lot of ways, and and whatever, and going to living a pretty traditional Jewish life means that people don't respond as aggressively. They may think of me as more moderate sometimes than I really am because of the cultural signifiers. And I think people who don't look the way I do have a much, much harder time regardless of what they say, to be honest. But I also think that I actually really do consider myself a liberal in the sense that I believe in individual rights. I believe in I understand that equality under the law can still leave systems of tremendous inequality, right? A post-apartheid South Africa is a savagely unequal place, even after apartheid, as is the United States. But I believe that equality under the law is the crucial, necessary first step towards deeper, more substantive forms of equality. And I am suspicious innately. I am innately suspicious of people who, in the name of substantive equality, are willing to override individual rights of people they disagree with. I do not like the fact that I don't like it. I didn't like it when pro-Palestine protesters at Columbia interrupted a class by an Israel studies class. I think that I believe it's very important to me to defend the rights of people to speak who I really disagree with. But I also do think beyond just believing that, I think a lot more than I think a lot about kind of how will things be received by other Jews who are more like the people I go to shul with, or people that my kids went to day school with, and that's partly just a choice based on where I've decided to live. I don't think it's a better choice than other people. Other people do other kinds of work which is at least as valuable, but because I've decided to live my life in those spaces, I tend to think a lot about how things will land, and so I try to be careful about using language that I feel like is just going to alienate people before I can even get started, So I do think that what Israel, the system of what Israel is doing, deserves the label apartheid, and I think that there's a growing consensus that what Israel is doing in Gaza is genocide. But I don't lead with those terms because I feel like they sometimes, in the communities that I'm in, they give people they make it easier for people to check out. And so what I find is more effective is to try to describe as best I can, the lived reality that Palestinians live under Israeli control. And so I would say to people, listen, you don't want to call it apartheid, but can we agree that Palestinians and Jews in the West Bank live in the same territory, but Palestinians don't have due process, they don't have citizenship, they don't have the right to vote, they need military permission to travel, whereas Jews have all of those rights. And so if you don't want to call that apartheid, don't call it apartheid, but does it accord with your values? I mean, if you don't want to call what's happening in Gaza genocide, what do you think about the fact that Israel has destroyed the most basic conditions of human life, right? And so we don't need to agree on the term, but hopefully we can agree that this is not the way human beings should be treated.
Shale Kilroy from the United Jewish People's Order.
Okay, this question is maybe might seem a bit pointed, and it's not meant at all to be a gotcha. But I think it gets at something really important that the Jewish community is grappling with, and you touched on it in the answer to your last question, but maybe you could elaborate. Are you an anti-Zionist? And if you are, why don't you call yourself one? And if you aren't, why aren't you?
Yeah, I have a strange relation to this term because I find that most people just call me an anti-Zionist, without asking me. And that's not a crazy view to hold because I oppose the idea of a Jewish state. I oppose the idea of a state that gives Jews legal privileges over Palestinians. I guess the reason that I haven't embraced this term is I think that there is something in the cultural Zionist tradition of Jews who believe very strongly in a Jewish culture in Palestine and Israel, even you could call it Jewish society, but oppose the Jewish state. People like Martin Buber and Judah Magnus and Henrietta Schultz, who founded Hadassah, even though Hadassah doesn't like to tell people that they were founded by someone who opposed the Jewish state. I think that tradition, there are very legitimate critiques of those people, or they were creatures of their time. I don't agree with them in every particularity, but to me, the reason that I find that tradition very compelling is that it is so much the norm in much Jewish discourse to assume that if there isn't a Jewish state, there can't be flourishing Jewish life in Israel and Palestine, right? That there can't be Hebrew-speaking communities, that there can't be flourishing Jewish cultural production. And to me, referring to the cultural Zionist tradition is a way of referring to a lineage which breaks that connection between a supremacist state and flourishing Jewish life. Not just Jews surviving, but Jews flourishing and doing the kind of cultural production, the revival of Hebrew as a living language, Hebrew-speaking communities. I hope there are also Arabic-speaking communities. But there is something, to me, very, very powerful about that. And that's why I want to remind people of the value of thinking about cultural Zionism, and it's why I don't embrace the term anti-Zionist, even though many of my best friends are anti-Zionist, and indeed, even though I am considered an anti-Zionist by many people, regardless of what I say.
Well, we've come to the end of our show. We'd like to thank you for listening, and we'd like to thank everyone who made our podcast possible, including United Jewish People's Order Executive Director Serena Sarin, Erfan Talebi, Anil Wazana, and of course, author Peter Beinart, and the various special guests who asked him their fascinating questions. This podcast was recorded at Walt Whitman Studios in Toronto. The theme music was composed by Serena Sarin with help from me. I'm David Wall. Until next time, seid gesund.